opening of Parliament.
A brand new session of Parliament is about to begin following Labour's resounding election victory. Later this morning, His Majesty the King will arrive here at the Palace of Westminster to deliver the King's speech. Welcome to the state opening of Parliament for 2024. A very good morning to you from our sumptuous surroundings here in the House of Lords. As the head of state, it's one of the King's primary duties to open Parliament. And in just under an hour, His Majesty the King, Charles III, accompanied by the Queen, will arrive at the Palace of Westminster for his second state opening in just over 8 months. For the first time in 14 years, the speech will be written by a Labour government following their general election win just 13 days ago, when the country emphatically returned Labour to power. Well, today is a huge moment for Sir Keir Starmer, as it's his first state opening as Prime Minister. He left 10 Downing Street just moments ago to travel here to the Palace of Westminster. Later in the programme, we'll be talking to novices and veterans at Westminster about the new parliamentary landscape. But today is also about the pomp and pageantry that comes with a ceremony which has aspects that can be traced back many centuries. We'll be exploring the roots of some of those customs and practices that make this such an impressive spectacle. In the House of Lords, peers and guests have already started to arrive to secure their seats for this, the biggest event in the parliamentary calendar. Once on the throne, the King will summon members of the House of Commons and then unveil the government's legislative priorities for the session ahead. We'll be discussing the wider political context later in the programme and also talking to some of the newest MPs elected just a few weeks, nay, days ago. With me in the studio, enjoying the imposing surroundings of the House of Lords, are my distinguished guests. They include Baroness de Sousa, a former Lord Speaker. That's the presiding officer of the House of Lords, and it's a job that she held for 5 years. Lord Lisvane, who had a long career in the House of Commons, where he served with distinction. He was the clerk of the House, and both of them are crossbench peers. I'm also joined by an author who is never far from matters royal. That's the Daily Mail writer and royal biographer Robert Hardman. And, of course, where there's politics, there is Chris Mason, the BBC's political editor. Good morning to you all. Baroness de Sousa, can I start with you? You've seen this ceremony many times from the perspective of the House of Lords. What does today mean to you?
You know, it's such an ancient ceremony and ritual, and it is, after all, one of the few times that the monarch and peers and MPs get together in the House of Lords. So there is a buzz about it. There's tremendous excitement, and one does feel privileged. But I think also one has to say that it is a very sort of Westminster thing to happen. It's a very parliamentary thing to happen. And it's undoubtedly true that there are an enormous amount of people outside who have no idea what this ritual is all about. That doesn't necessarily matter. Ritual is sometimes important, even though you don't fully understand it.
And we hope to explain that ritual.
But it has been written, someone had been written, Emma Crewe, I think it was, who said the genius of the state opening, whereby it underlines the majesty of government, the importance of peers and the political clout of MPs.
Lord Lisvane, you were an official in the Commons for many years. What did your role entail?
Well, I was the principal advisor to the House on all its procedure and business and on the Constitution. But I was also in an odd pairing of jobs. I was the chief executive of the House of Commons administration with a house service of 2,500 people and a budget of about $250 million. So it was very much a 24/7 job. Exactly. And it's really interesting now to see Parliament from a rather, well, privileged but a different angle.
I'm sure.
And certainly I'm casting my mind back to previous state openings. My memories are of nerves, because the complexities have to go absolutely right, and people will notice if they don't.
We'll go into those complexities just very shortly. Robert Hardman, I wanted to bring you in. It's a very significant day, this, in the royal calendar.
Absolutely. I mean, when you're a constitutional monarch, I mean, this is absolutely this and the day you appoint a prime minister. They go to the heart of what it means to be a constitutional head of state. And the king. I mean, this is his second state opening as king. Of course, he also gave the speech in 2022 when the Queen was unwell. But it's worth remembering, he's probably seen more of these, or certainly goes back further than anybody else in the chamber, because he saw his first state opening as a teenager when he accompanied the Queen in 1967. So he won't be a stranger to any of this.
And Chris, just a brief word. It's also about the new MPs and about the excitement for them.
Yeah, and for more than half of the members of the House of Commons, they are new to being members of the House of Commons, which is extraordinary. More than every other MP is new. So whilst for some, this ritual will have a familiarity to it, as it might to some of our viewers, for so many of the MPs who will be in the Commons this afternoon as the debate gets underway after we've had the more formal proceedings from the King, what a thing to witness firsthand for the first time.
Thank you very much, Chris. Well, lots of politics, of course, but the state opening of Parliament is all about tradition, with so many of the fine details of what we're about to see stemming from specific moments in the history of the Palace of Westminster. One is the ceremonial search of the cellars, which took place earlier this morning.
Search party. Slow march.
Now, this is always performed by the yeomen of the Guard. They are the oldest royal bodyguards, the oldest British military corps still in existence. The corps was founded by Henry VII in 1485, and the search dates back to the failed gunpowder plot. And you can see them with their lanterns. They're ready for the search. The Guard started in the Prince's Chamber, which is next to the House of Lords, and directly above the cellars, where Guy Fawkes was discovered in 1605. I mean, Lord Lisvane, this is one of the first moments of a day that's full of ceremony and costumes and rituals that people don't necessarily understand, but which still have significance.
Well, indeed, and I think this is a very good illustration. It's a survival. Searching the cellars. Now, the cellars in 1605 were very different. And if they really search the cellars today, they go down into what, when I was chief executive, I used to describe as the Cathedral of Horror, because you find superheated steam, sewage, water, comms, IT, all higgledy-piggledy on top of each other. And if they go down there, I mean, it'd be quite an achievement to come back out again. So that is something which... and of course, they get a reward for the search, which is a glass of port at the end.
A glass of port. Who would say no to that? There's more ceremony happening right now, because we can see the Queen Alexandra's state coach leaving Buckingham Palace, and it's carrying the regalia, which represent the monarch's authority. And we'll talk a little bit more about the regalia a little bit later, but they include the Imperial State Crown, which His Majesty the King will wear, the cap of maintenance, and also the sword of state. The state coach was built in 1865, and the Crown procession is accompanied by a regalia escort from the Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment. Well, at the heart of the Palace of Westminster is Central Lobby, and that connects the two chambers, the Lords and the Commons. And there for us this morning, at the centre of the action, is Tina Dahealy.
I am indeed. Hello, Rita. Hello to everyone watching at home. We are in prime position here to see some of the processions that come through this morning. Now, many people have never seen this ceremony before. As Chris mentioned, more than half of the intake, 335 MPs were inducted, new MPs, I should say, were inducted into Parliament last week, and we are joined by one of them, the youngest female MP, Rosie Wrighting. Congratulations, first of all.
Thank you.
What was your first week in Westminster like?
Well, it's definitely been a whirlwind. I mean, my first time in this building last week was my very first time in this building in my life. So to step foot here and really see the beauty that is the Houses of Parliament, but also to have my tour around, meet my buddy, and start setting up my office has been, yeah, quite incredible and quite a whirlwind.
What's the best advice you've been given so far?
So an MP told me to, when you're walking around, remember to look up, which I think was pretty good advice because, yeah, even if you look up here today, there's some amazing ceilings here.
What would you say you're most looking forward to today? Obviously politics, but lots of pomp and pageantry and traditions too.
Yeah, and to be honest, it's just an absolute honour to be able to witness this firsthand and kind of see it with your own eyes. So that in itself is something I'm massively looking forward to. And of course, looking forward to seeing the legislation that will be the first steps in delivering that change for the people across the UK, but the people of Kettering.
Now, Rosie, I think I'm right in saying you were just about to turn 4 when Labour won Kettering at the 2001 election, and now here you are.
Quite correct. I was born into the last Labour government, and now, as a 26-year-old, I'm a member of Parliament in the current Labour government. So I know the difference that the last Labour government made, and it's an honour to be a part of this one.
Well, Rosie, enjoy today. Rosie Wrighting, MP.
Much.
Back to you, Rita.
Thank you very much, Tina. There is the state coach, Queen Alexandra's state coach, bringing the regalia, which represent the monarch's authority, to the Palace of Westminster. And the regalia precede the arrival of the king to Westminster. Just thinking about what Tina was talking about to Rosie there, it's a measure of the overwhelming Labour victory, isn't it? That more than half of this intake of MPs are new to the Commons, as you were saying, Chris. I wonder, Baroness de Sousa, what would your advice be to new arrivals?
Listen and learn. I mean, it's going to be enormously confusing. Apart from anything else, they've got to find their way, through various corridors, and there's something like, I don't know, 365 rooms that they're going to have to sort of find their way to. But I think each of them will want to make an impact, and I think that it probably is wise to wait a bit and see, what kind of committees you feel that you have something to offer to, because otherwise, you will get crowds and crowds and crowds of new MPs sitting on committees which haven't got the direction that one would wish.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Lord Lisvane? What would you say to somebody new?
It's a huge intake. The biggest one I had to deal with was 2010, when there were 227. So this is a real challenge, I think, for the House authorities and for the members themselves. Attlee used to say to new members, his advice was specialise and stay out of the bars. Now, I'm not sure about the bars, but specialising is very good advice. But I would concur with Francis, actually. Listen, you soak things up. There's an osmosis that can serve new members very well over the first few months.
Robert, the King has a third Prime Minister in just 18 months. Give us an insight into what that transition is like for a monarch.
Well, the late Queen always, found these moments, took them incredibly seriously. So does he, and I think it's it is remarkable that, he hasn't been on the throne for 2 years yet, and yet here we are on his third Prime Minister. But I do think it underlines the sort of sense and continuity and stability that comes with the monarchy. You get the rough and tumble of politics of this end of the mall. You need a bit of stability and continuity at the other. And that's what he provides. That's what this sort of ceremony today does. And I think it's a wonderful illustration of really where he sort of sits in the national firmament. Here he is in all this glory, and we'll see him in his crown. This is the only time, apart from a coronation, when he wears a crown. And he's on the throne, surrounded by peers and bishops and everybody else. And the Commons have to sort of scrabble in and stand at the back. But they're the ones who've written the speech he reads. So it's a great illustration of our constitution in human form, if you like.
Royal stamp on the legislative programme, but why isn't it actually spoken by, the Prime Minister? Why does it have to be the monarch that mouths the words of government? After all, the monarch is meant to be apolitical, but this is a very political speech.
That's very interesting. Hold that thought and we'll come back to it. Lady de Souza, we're seeing here the Household Cavalry, 36 dismounted troopers arriving at the Sovereign's staircase and lining the staircase. The Household Cavalry is formed of the two most senior regiments of the British Army. They're formed from the Life Guards, who have red tunics and white plume, looking resplendent there, and the Blues and Royals in navy tunics and red plume. And they're commanded today by Major Dean Owens from the Blues and Royals. And I don't know if we can see, but on the walls behind the troops as they're lined up are marks that have been left by their spurs in ceremonies gone by on the stone walls. I wonder if we can see this. I'm being told that we can't, but there are marks there that I went on a walk a little while ago, and you can see the marks of previous ceremonies left there. Let's go back now to Tina Dahealy, who's in Central Lobby with some special guests.
Well, I am delighted to be joined by two people who have key roles to play in today's proceedings. Mary Jane Jung, Director of the Historic Collections at the Palace of Westminster, and Urbana Oyet, Sergeant-at-Arms in the House of Commons. Very important role for you today, Mary Jane. Tell us about the thrones.
Well, there are two thrones in the chamber today. One is for the King himself, which always stays in the Parliament, but we also take the opportunity to borrow the Consort's throne from Houghton Hall, and that's obviously for Queen Camilla, and they're put side by side in the niche in the chamber.
Urbana, what's your role today? What will you be doing?
Well, part of my role today will be, first, as with every day, leading the Speaker's procession. And I guess for today, the difference would be the timing is slightly earlier, about 5 minutes earlier, and also our uniform. Today we're in full ceremonial uniform, which is slightly different from our day-to-day uniform, and away from the ceremonial, maintaining access and order on the estate.
Now, Mary Jane, you've previously been involved in the ceremonial search of the cellars. What are you looking for?
Well, we're looking for any would-be Guy Fawkes lurking in the basement rooms of the palace. And we make sure, and I have a full bodyguard with me who can deal with any intruders. But of course, there are none.
Of course not. And what are you most looking forward to today, Urbana?
Well, I'm looking forward to actually having our new members participate for the first time in a state opening, a very important one with the King here, a new Parliament, and of course supporting the Speaker in all the proceedings of today.
Mary Jane, for you?
I think it's a wonderful day where all the different teams get to work together and we celebrate all our preparation up till now, and we just enjoy it.
We're wishing you both the best of luck for today. Thank you very much for speaking to us. Back to you, Rita.
Tina, thank you, and to your guests as well. The yeomen of the Guard, who we saw earlier during the ceremonial search, are now processing down through the Royal Gallery. Now, the Royal Gallery is a splendid, beautiful chamber, the largest in the Palace of Westminster, and it's used for state receptions, for dinners, for parliamentary ceremonies. And the yeomen are going to position themselves at the sides of the gallery to form a guard of honour for the King and for the Sovereign's procession. Chris, I wanted to ask you about MPs and what sort of atmosphere they're going to be coming into, because we've heard about the excitement, particularly for the new MPs, but there's a lot of concern about safety now, isn't there? And I think particularly the events in the United States will be very high in people's minds.
Without question, what's been really striking in the last few years, speaking to MPs, so often because it's the nature of this place, who will contest almost anything in terms of policy ideas and all the rest of it, there's a uniform concern about their own personal safety, a reflection on the killings that there's been in recent years of sitting members of Parliament, obviously reflections on what happens overseas, new MPs confronted by everything that seems familiar about the place that becomes their workplace, and yet when they turn up feels very, very alien, and there's a lot of corridors to understand and procedures to try and grapple with, whilst at the same time trying to ensure their own safety. Yes, here to an extent, but actually of greater concern to many of them is when they're back in their constituencies, when they're not in a postcode surrounded by armed police officers and the security that is part and parcel of day-to-day life in the Palace of Westminster. And then the dilemma that they each face, which is they want to be available, they want to be open, they want to be able to meet constituents, to attend events, to be that conduit to try and help constituents with the problems that they come to for help. And how you do that whilst at the same time trying to maintain a sense of personal safety is a real dilemma for so many MPs now.
While you're speaking there, Chris, we see more of the pomp and pageantry. The gentlemen at arms walking through the Royal Gallery. They are the most senior bodyguard group, classed as the nearest guard to the king on state occasions. And they're seen as senior to the yeomen, if I can put it that way. They are gentlemen at arms. And you can just see behind them that huge painting. There are two, it's one of a pair. And they're by Daniel Maclise, and they both depict scenes from the Napoleonic Wars. One is of the death of Nelson, and the other is of the Duke of Wellington at Trafalgar. Oh, there's a beautiful detail.
There was some question when the French president came many years ago whether they should cover these British victories with a sheet. And they decided no, in the end they wouldn't. But the president walked straight down without looking to left or right.
So it was an issue.
It was an issue.
There are fragments of anti-aircraft shell in the Trafalgar one. Stuck in the wall.
Not of the time, clearly.
Not of the time.
Yes. What, Robert, do we expect from the King delivering the speech today? Will his style be different, do you think?
Well, it's a very interesting question, Rita. I think people will be listening out carefully because, I mean, this has, since the last state opening, been a tumultuous few months for the King with his health diagnosis. I mean, the monarchy as a whole has been through a pretty challenging few months, and yet things have started to get back on track. You know, we saw him out in France, in Normandy, for the 80th anniversary, the trooping the colour, these important things, a Japanese state visit. Despite being out of action for the earlier part of the year, the King never missed any of his constitutional duties. In fact, he didn't miss a single scheduled audience with the Prime Minister. The red boxes, all that stuff carried on. Straight after the election, appointing a new Prime Minister, there was no delay in appointing new Secretaries of State. All the Privy Council machinery, if you like, that all carried on. So I think this is a great reset today. It's showing that the sort of the monarchy is back. But as you say, people will be listening out, you know, to hear him speak. But he's very good at these occasions. I mean, I remember when he did his first. It was called the Queen's speech because he was speaking on behalf of the Queen when she was ill. But he practices it very carefully because he knows it's political and that therefore there mustn't be any intonation. Whatever the policy is, you've got to deliver it flat. And the late Queen did that, and I'm sure he will too.
And Baroness de Souza, you were making the point that why is the government's speech, because it's a speech written by the government, why is it being delivered by the monarch?
You know, it's interesting because there's been a great deal of discussion and a report from the House of Lords on whether or not the state opening is a necessary ceremony or whether it should be improved. And it has been improved by increments. I mean, for example, the Lord Chancellor doesn't have to walk backwards down the steps, which is great because everyone
perilous.
held their breath. And people sort of say, well, why do you have to search the soul? As we know jolly well, apart from the fact that it's sort of a descent into hell, as Robert says, it is not going to have a gunpowder plot in it, or at least we hope it's not going to. But I think that, you know, in a sense, what we're talking about here is ritual, and ritual is important. It is a very unifying force. And even though people may not understand the import of many of these actions that take place, it binds people. And I wonder whether if we had just an ordinary sort of, you know, shirt and tie marching into the House of Lords without this ceremony, whether Parliament would have the same impact. though, of course, there is the view that it doesn't reflect Parliament's wish to be transparent.
Queen Alexandra coach has just entered the Palace of Westminster into Sovereign's Gate. And we're just waiting for the regalia to be brought out. Some interesting detail here about the people who are involved in this part of the ritual. And it's the King's barge master, who is Chris Livett, who oversees the transfer of the crown. And the monarch today retains 24 royal watermen under his command. They form one of the oldest appointments in the royal household, and they're here as footmen. And a reminder that in the past, the crown jewels were brought by river rather than by road.
Weighs 1.3 kilograms.
1.3 kilograms, that's heavy.
You see, the man in the white gloves there is a very important man today. It's the crown jeweller, Mark Appleby, one the only crown apart from...
It's a heavy responsibility.
3,000 precious stones.
You see there the cap of maintenance, and the sword of state will be brought out to Lord Lisvane. We were talking a little earlier about the importance of ritual and ceremony, and I think you made the point that this forms part of our constitution. It is our constitution embodied, given that we don't have a written constitution. That was your view.
Yes, indeed. We don't have a written constitution. We have constitutional arrangements. And in Walter Bagehot's terms, I think we're seeing the dignified part of the constitution today rather than the efficient part of the constitution. But these elements here, you have the great sword of state, which symbolises the monarch's right to protect his realm. You have the cap of maintenance, whose origins are rather more obscure, but nevertheless, they're indicative of a dignity. Some people think that a cap of maintenance is actually quite useful if you've got to put a crown on, because it's a sort of cushion for the head. But there is something like a cap of maintenance inside the crown anyway, in order to improve the king's comfort when he wears it. And as Francis was saying, it weighs 2.3 pounds. So think of walking around with a bag of sugar on your head, slightly top-heavy as well, and it's quite a demanding process to go through.
That is hard work, isn't it?
They have it delivered the night before, so the late Queen used to wear it around the house the day before to get used to it.
Practice.
Yeah. George VI used to wear it gardening now and then.
Gardening. But very hard to bend your head to read the
You have to hold it up like that.
Yes, yes.
Gives you very good posture. And you were mentioning, Lord Lisvane, that the cap of maintenance... In fact, I'm just going to interrupt myself because we can see the King and Queen now leaving Buckingham Palace to make the journey to the Palace of Westminster. They're in the Diamond Jubilee State Coach, which is a very fine coach, and it looks very old, doesn't it? But it was in fact made in 2010 for the late Queen's Diamond Jubilee. And that doesn't stop it from being very fine, and I think it is fitted with a few modern comforts.
Got hydraulic suspension and central heating, among other things. But it's a great, it's a sort of museum on four wheels. It's got little bits of British history coming through. It's got fragments of...
At the top of the crown there, you can see what is probably the oldest jewel that's possessed by the royal family.
And it is called?
It is called St. Edward's Sapphire, and it is thought to have been in the ring of Edward the Confessor.
It looks very fine. The crown is coming up the sovereign's staircase to be displayed in the Royal Gallery. And it, of course, precedes the arrival of the monarch, and it's being carried by the controller, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Vernon. And I learned while wandering around the Palace of Westminster a little while ago that this blue carpet is set down for the occasion, that usually these floors are stone or tile, but they are set down for the state opening, and they are blue because this is an area of the palace that is the sovereign's. Now, there we see the crown in all its glory. Lord Lisvane, you said that you knew all the jewels. I'm testing
Not all
you now.
3,170 of them, no, not at all. But some of them are, there's Cullinan II, which is at the front, which is 317 carats of diamond. There's the Black Prince's ruby. Supposedly, it's 170 carats, given to the Black Prince in 1367. So it is a compendium of English, I think, rather than British, English history. Indeed, indeed. All in one place and all in 2.3 pounds or 1.06, I think, kilograms.
It is said.
And there we see the sort of state and the cap of maintenance also being displayed in the Royal Gallery.
It is said that William the Conqueror used to put on a special ceremonial crown for special Christian festivals and talk with the bishops and archbishops and also with his barons. And he used to parley, the French sort of parley, and that's where the word parliament actually comes from. So that was one of the original, as it were, state openings where the king, William the Conqueror at that time, actually discussed with his barons what should be done, what the legislative programme should be. So it is really 900 years. It's a very ancient ceremony.
Indeed it is, yes. There'll be a buzz of excitement in the Royal Gallery at the moment, but people are actually quite quiet at the moment, aren't they? There's not that much, yes, there's quite a lot of...
Could you hear a pin drop?
People watching the ceremony. So this is the herald's procession. The heralds are a role that have existed since the 15th century. They were originally messengers sent by monarchs to convey messages or proclamations. And of course, we use the word to herald to this day, don't we? And they're recognised by their very distinctive tabards. Very fine, beautifully embroidered. And many of their ceremonial duties have in fact disappeared, but heralds do still carry out ceremonies under the Earl Marshal. The Earl Marshal is the Duke of Norfolk, and he's responsible for ceremonial involving the sovereign. The king is on his way in the Diamond Jubilee coach, accompanied by members of the Household Cavalry. And as the monarch approaches the Palace of Westminster, the Lord Great Chamberlain, and that is Lord Carrington, is taking the crown into the robing room, and this is where His Majesty and the Queen will enter Parliament and be robed for the occasion. What's it like being in that Royal Gallery for this occasion? I'm looking at the people who know.
It's quite moving.
Yes.
Partly because of the silence, but I think that the moving moment for me was when the heralds trumpeted the fact that the doors to the robing room were going to open and the monarch would come through.
And we're still to see that.
And that was all very, very special. And, you know, these things are practiced down to sort of the last step. Someone will always get it wrong, but the royals never get it wrong.
They can't get it wrong.
I've never been in the Royal Gallery for this part of the ceremony, but I remember the perspective from the other end. Sitting in my chair at the table as Clerk of the House, with all the doors open, you look straight across and see the monarch on the throne. Oh. And with the television lights, the sparkle of the jewels is absolutely fantastic.
must be. It must be. The peers all getting ready for the speech. The House of Lords packed, of course. And there are dignitaries as well. Ambassadors?
Yeah, there are, just outside Parliament. It's the poshest car park in the UK, I think, right now. BMWs and Mercedes, they've got their flags on the bonnet. And that's a reminder, that whilst this occasion to some might seem, as we see the Archbishop of Canterbury,
the Archbishop of Canterbury next to the Archbishop of York.
Yeah, that whilst this might seem otherworldly to some, it's magnetic power in a diplomatic sense for those representing countries as ambassadors, high commissioners here in the UK. This is a ticket to which they're invited, and my goodness, the car park of the street outside very much shows that.
And a chance to network, I suppose, in a very high-powered way.
Absolutely, without question. Yeah, and that'll be happening right now in amongst all of the chit-chat, without question.
In 2016, the Queen decided that she was going to take the lift rather than go up those rather tricky stairs. And then when the time came to leave, she was obviously going to go down in the lift. So the lift was called, and in she got with black rod. And the lift, instead of going down, went up. And the doors opened automatically. So we're on the sort of second or third floor. And there was a sort of a hapless clerk face to face with his monarch. So that must have been a bit of a surprise for him, and indeed possibly for the monarch. But I am told that she really rather liked it when things went a bit wrong.
We don't know how the clerk reacted, I assume. This is the Lord Speaker, Lord McFall. He's the Speaker of the House of Lords. And this is his procession to the Sovereign's entrance of the Palace of Westminster. And you, of course, did this.
Very, very heavy. Very heavy.
Wearing those robes, yes.
Really weighs you down because it's pure gold. Oh, well, not all of it, but the braiding is pure gold. So
you need
have
to
a
walk
bearer.
Slowly.
You have a bearer, going down, but then they hook your robe up, and you don't have a bearer on the way procession through the ceremony, just ahead of the Queen, as it was in my day, Queen, but now the King and the Queen.
Is the robe adjusted for you?
Yes, indeed. What they do is they take off the entire border and sort of sew it on again, because most people are taller than I am, so...
That's why the King and the Queen have pages, because their robes are so long and heavy that they couldn't possibly
And we'll
leave
see
it to
those
one person.
pages a little later on.
Later, when you see the Speaker of the House of Commons, it's a very similar robe, silk damask, and it takes about 180 hours to make. Decorated with acorns and oak leaves to
It's so beautiful.
symbolise strength.
And they're kept in mothballs for the year.
For their annual outing.
It's a lovely shot of the procession coming out Whitehall, because for some reason the state openings always seem to be in the autumn or winter
Oh,
in
and
the
I
rain,
love
don't they?
that.
And it's nice to see it in the
The
sun.
clattering of the horses on a frosty morning is very exciting. It really
Quite
is.
exciting
Yes.
this morning as well. The Lord High Chancellor's procession is led by Antonia Romeo, who is Clerk of the Crown, and the Lord High Chancellor is the Secretary of State for Justice, Shabana Mahmood.
New in post, quite a moment for her.
Yeah. She wasn't entirely sure she'd get her seat, was she?
So, keen contest, and gosh, how the election seems some distance away now.
Yeah,
Only a couple
already.
of weeks, and then straight
Already,
into a
yeah.
ceremony like this. Such a moment for her.
Can she have imagined that this might have 3 weeks ago before the election? She may not have imagined this would be happening.
Well, quite, and I'm struck, having spent much of the last couple of months out on the road covering the general election campaign. What a contrast, really. Now, granted, the politics will roar back this afternoon. The efficient part of the Constitution that Lord Lisvane was referring to, the reference to Walter Bagehot. But if you compare the noise and the contention of the election campaign, very, very party political by definition, with the ceremony of today, at least the morning ceremony of today before the politics returns this afternoon, that contrast is so stark.
But it's also a contrast with, we've just had an election in France. I was out covering that. That was very bitter, very turbulent, and actually compared to what we've seen over there, this today, I think it does underline something about a sense of stability, that we just handed over. The government has gone, the government's calm. It's all happened without any murmur of disquiet.
And continuity.
Yes.
Stability.
The titles remain the same. The occupiers change, don't they, of the offices? Yeah.
The King and Queen have made their way down Whitehall and are now very close to arriving at the Palace of Westminster. What a wonderful sight it is. Beautiful July sunshine, and the sun has shone today in London.
Many of those horses, of course, were the same horses that took part in the coronation, which another event in the rain, so nice to see them out in the sunshine.
Let's hope one doesn't escape this time.
Oh, let's...
See that clattering of horses and the jangling of the bridles announcing the arrival of the king is really is quite momentous.
That was the band of the Welsh Guards with the national anthem and the Guard of Honour provided by the Welsh Guards, commanded by Major Edward Emlyn Williams. King and Queen are arriving in the... The fanfare is sounded to signal their Majesties' arrival. The Union Jack is lowered over the Palace of Westminster, and the Royal Standard is now flying to signify the presence of the King in the Palace of Westminster. They make their way up the Sovereign's staircase. And by tradition, this is the only route that the Sovereign can take to the House of Lords. Black Rod is just coming up the stairs, and Lord McFall, the Lord Speaker, along with the Leader of the House of Commons, Lucy Powell, and in front of the King and Queen is the Earl Marshal on the left, the Duke of Norfolk, and also the Lord Great Chamberlain, Lord Carrington, Rupert Carrington, and he's the son of Peter Carrington. Well, the King and Queen have gone into the robing room to get ready for the state procession. So I'd like to welcome my next guests as we turn our attention to the politics of the day. And my guests are representing the three biggest parties in the House of Commons following the July the 4th election. And they are Daisy Cooper of the Liberal Democrats. Good morning to you, Daisy. Sir Chris Bryant of the Labour Party, and also Andrew Griffith of the Conservative Party. morning to you all. And still with me, of course, is the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason. So, Chris, what are we expecting from this speech?
There'll be a blizzard of bills, so planned new laws from the new government, keen to project a sense of energy and direction, and I guess turn those manifesto promises with the horses and the fancy dress into the beginnings of intended laws. There's going to be the best part of 40 bills or draft bills announced by the King in the next 15 or 20 minutes, so that there'll be plenty for the new government to be getting on with. They're making the case that that is more new bills than at the equivalent moment for Tony Blair back in 1997. Clearly, though, you know, a bill is an intended piece of legislation. You've still got to make it into a law, and governments can get sidetracked or things can happen, events can happen. Nonetheless, they have a colossal majority, so it's reasonable to assume a fair chunk of these will become law in time. And they are also written down what are clearly the first priorities of the new government, because a parliamentary session is not as long as a parliamentary term. There's other stuff they can get onto in the coming years, but stuff that they really want to do, it would make sense that they put in their first King's speech. And so we'll get a sense of what those things are in the next 10, 15 minutes. There won't be any surprises. It will be putting forward a lot of the stuff that they were campaigning on in the last couple of months into the legislative process that will start in the coming days and weeks. Parliament, the Commons getting underway in a couple of hours, the debate beginning, and that legislative process starting.
Yes, after the pomp and pageantry, it starts immediately, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Chris Bryant, as Chris Mason was saying,
corner.
This is the Chris corner. It makes life easy for me.
Yes, good. Well, I'm glad.
So you've got this huge majority, 174. There are big expectations and big ambitions, clearly, but not much wriggle room in terms of money.
Oh, in terms of money, no. I think I was always a very bad rugby player, but when I played once at Twickenham, I broke my leg because of a hospital pass. From a Conservative MP, in fact, but and it does feel a bit like a hospital pass in terms of the economic situation in the country. That is true. But look, this is, if you like, the sugar babes moment. This is when we push the button. This is when we press the reset button on the political agenda in the country. We're very keen to show that we've got energy, drive, determination. We want economic growth is at the heart of everything we want to achieve. So we're talking about, as Chris says, 35 bills. That's a lot of legislative change. I would hope that we would manage to get all of those through. Some of them might, of course, end up being draft bills now and then pursued further in a second a session of Parliament, but everything through from really important scientific innovations that we need to legislate for, to building more homes, planning reform, putting the Office of Budgetary Responsibility on a clearer, independent footing. There's a lot in there, and we're kind of brimming with excitement. It's been very strange being a minister in an office for the last 10 days and just going through all the things we want to get done.
And you have two roles. You are Minister of State in two departments.
Yeah, Science, Innovation and Technology, where I'm doing data, and I'm probably not meant to say yet, but I think there might be a bill that I might be involved in.
Let's not jump the gun just yet. And I never thought I'd hear the sugar babes mentioned during the state opening of Parliament. Thank you very much. Andrew Griffiths, I mean, you come to this new session of Parliament in a very different mood. You suffered really a disaster in the election. How do you regroup now, and also in the knowledge that your leader is not going to be your leader for very much longer?
Well, we've got our important constitutional job that starts today, which is to be the official opposition. I think for us as a party, the way back includes building credibility and trust and competence as discharging that function as the official opposition. I mean, we're seeing, as Chris said, really a blizzard of bills. I mean, if there's 35 bills, that's bigger than the percentage share of vote that this government was elected on.
Oh.
So, legislate at haste, repent at leisure. We will do our proper job of scrutiny. We all wish the best for our country. So if there's good measures in there that's going to help move our country forward, make people prosperous, allow them to live longer and happier lives, then we will support that. But you've got to look as well about the dangers of a government with a big majority that's been out of power, and perhaps not all of the new colleagues have Chris's experience, and making sure that we get that legislation right. It's really important. We do a number of things in Parliament. We legislate. We also scrutinise the spend and help hold government to account. They promised not to increase taxes in the election. We will hold them to account and make sure they do not break that promise.
And just briefly, Andrew, if the government does introduce bills that had originally been introduced by the Conservative government, will you back them?
Well, certainly constructively oppose, and that does not mean opposing things for their own sake. So if you look at things like the Martin's Law, for example, there were some other bills that...
Martin's Law on making...
on prevention and making venues safe, that sort of thing. So, yeah, of course, I mean, the word is constructive opposition. We will be, collaborate where we need to, but we've also got a proper job that the majority of the people in this country did not vote for Chris's party. And it's important that the Parliament does its job of scrutiny and makes bills better.
OK. Let's see what is in the speech. I'm being told that your microphone is there's a little bit of an issue with it, so many apologies to viewers for that, and we'll see what we can do. Daisy, last time I saw you, you were in the studio during election night with a broad grin on your face. The Liberal Democrats had a great night. How do you make your voice heard, though? You've got 72 MPs now, up from 11, but you are still the third party.
Well, look, in the last Parliament, there were just 15 of us, and we did make our voice heard even then, because we were the first party to call for a windfall tax. We were the first party to put the sewage scandal on the parliamentary agenda. And now with 72 of us, we'll be a much stronger voice in Parliament. What I would say is that during the general election, we campaigned relentlessly on the NHS and social care. We put it front and centre of our campaign, and it won't be a surprise to the government or indeed to anybody else that what we would really want to see today from the King's speech are some really strong commitments on health and social care. So we've said, for example, we want to see new legal rights for people to see a GP within 7 days, for people to get their urgent cancer treatment within 62 days, and for the Secretary of State and for ministers to actually have a statutory duty to actually meet some of those targets. We also campaigned on the cost of living and, of course, on the sewage scandal. So I think across those three issues, we really want to see those coming out in the King's speech today.
Chris, we are going to see a more varied House of Commons, aren't we, with reform, with the Greens now with 4 MPs. Will this make a difference to the texture of the debate, or are they too small?
It's going to be fascinating to see, because Parliament will just feel and sound rather different. It'll take even those of us who spend a lot of time looking in on Parliament from the press gallery quite a while to just get our heads around it. As we were saying before, in a more sort of constitutional context, the titles don't change, but the occupiers of various roles do. Reminding ourselves that the leader of the opposition, for now at least, is Rishi Sunak. For so long that was Keir Starmer. There's always a leader of the opposition, there's always a prime minister, but the people occupying those roles has changed. And then the spread on the benches, as you say. So the Liberal Democrats coming back as the third party in the House of Commons, the Scottish National Party, much shrivelled in terms of their Westminster presence from the last few parliaments. The Greens substantially increasing their number, Reform having a bigger presence than they did. So it'll be fascinating to see the interactions between the different parties, who gets noticed amongst the vast contingent of new MPs. It will feel very different.
I'm going to take you now to Central Lobby for a daily ritual, which is the Speaker's procession through the lobby into the chamber of the House of Commons. People waiting expectantly there.
You know, it's not all that old, this bit.
Ah, tell us, Chris. Don't debunk it for us.
Well, no, it feels very old, because all of us who've been around, we've known it forever, but it's not from the beginning of time. The Speaker just used to walk from his house to...
He's just about to come.
So he just used to walk from his house to the chamber. And then after the Second World War, it was a bit more complicated.
Hats off, strangers!
That cry of hats off, strangers is always shouted by the police inspector on duty, and today it's Inspector Hobbis. And the idea, Chris, is that you defer to the to the Speaker.
Because he's the most important citizen. He's the leading citizen of the nation. And you saw that in so many moments in the coronation and after the death of Her late Majesty. The Speaker is the leading citizen and has a role quite separate from any of the MPs and is actually higher in order of precedence than most people. There's an interesting moment later which when we slam the door in the face of Black Rod, which goes back to the 4th of January 1642 when the King tried to seize, King Charles I tried to seize 5 members of Parliament by storming into the Commons. And ever since then, we've slammed the door to him.
And we are going to see that very shortly.
And the Speaker then, in 1642, made the point that he was a servant of the House rather than of government. And that's why he plays such an important role as the leading citizen in the nation.
And there's the mace carried by Ugbana Oyet, who Tina Dahealy was talking to a little earlier. That is the Sergeant at Arms. The chamber very full on a very important day like this. Well, the day starts with prayers which are not televised, so we're going to leave the chamber there. Chris, you were saying that that is not necessarily a very old ritual, but that is part of the point of the state opening of Parliament and of daily rituals like this, that they build, there are layers and layers of different ceremonies there.
And things that have changed. I think one of your colleagues was referring to, who was on earlier, was referring to the Black Prince's ruby. But there's also the Stuart sapphire in the Imperial Crown. And that, of course, King James II ran off with when he fled Britain in the 1670s, and he then gave it to his son, who gave it to his grandson, who was a cardinal, and then we bought it back in 1807. So there's layers and layers of history, which is what, of course, we all love. And it's one of the things that I think endears us and fascinates us, is fascinating for lots of other countries around the world.
Yes, indeed. Let's bring it back to the politics of the day. Andrew Griffiths, I wonder how you find yourself here in terms of the mood within the party, given what happened on election night.
Well, look, we lost a lot of very good colleagues, and that's a shock and clearly a disappointment. And there's always a process as you go through of coming to terms with that, and then lifting one's eyes to the horizon, settling down to the job of work that we've got to do in different circumstances, and finding our way to do that as well. I was in government for 4.5 years. We've now got to regroup as a party and discharge that job of opposition. I disagree with Chris a little bit. Actually, the economy has been coming good. We're the fastest growing economy in the G7. Inflation, we heard again this morning, is bang on the Bank of England's 2% target, and unemployment is at an almost all-time low of just 4%. So, we'll have mixed views on that, but we think actually the economy is in an improving situation, particularly relative to some of our Western European peers.
The state trumpeters announcing the arrival of His Majesty the King. And the King's robe of state was made for Edward VII's coronation. And I should mention that it is Queen Camilla's 77th birthday today. So happy birthday to her.
The layers of history are again interesting. They've just walked past great big paintings by Maclise of 2 battles against the French, Waterloo and Trafalgar, and now they're in the Prince's chamber, which is, of course, the pictures of all the Tudors, divorced, beheaded, died.
Yes,
divorced, beheaded,
the
survived.
wives, Henry VIII and his wives, and also, I think, a very fine marble statue of Queen Victoria. This is the Prince's chamber.
And also now paintings, which are relatively new, of the old tapestries of the Armada that were lost in the fire in 1834.
It's a very fine room. Here we see Angela Smith, Baroness Smith, holding the cap of maintenance. And the former Chief of the Defence Staff we can see perhaps on the other side. That's Lord Richards holding the sword of state. And an interesting detail here, the monarch's throne is slightly higher than that of the Queen, indicating his ascendancy.
Sounds like a mobile phone going off in there.
My lords, pray be seated.
The signal is given by the Lord Great Chamberlain to Blackrod Sarah Clark, who sets off from Central Lobby at the heart of the Palace of Westminster. And from that position, she can actually see both chairs of the Lords and the Commons. And as tradition dictates, as Sir Chris Bryant was telling us, the doors of the Commons will be slammed in her face by the doorkeepers. And it's a demonstration of the independence of the House of Commons. Here it comes.
Open the door.
Blackrod!
She'll now step into the chamber of the House of Commons to deliver the King's message.
Mr. Speaker, the King commands this honourable House to attend His Majesty immediately in the House of Peers.
Sergeant-at-Arms takes the mace, and it's the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, who leads the way with Blackrod. Sarah Clark was formerly in charge of the administration of Wimbledon, she was telling me. So she knows a thing or two about organisations, large organisations.
This is the lip reading bit, isn't it?
Well, Chris, how good is your lip reading?
I was intrigued by the small talk that goes on here. So you've got the Prime Minister and the Conservative leader will be coming into shot in just a second. A penny for the exchanges as to what they have to say. The father and mother of the house just in front of the Noble Lee and Diane Abbott.
And their roles are just reversed, aren't they, Chris? It's Rishi Sunak now, the leader of the opposition.
This adjustment, as I say, even for those of us who professionally observe what goes on here all the time, it's quite mesmerising, the kind of hokey-cokey of job titles. So I'm very conscious for a fleeting view of Westminster. It's quite baffling because the terms are enduring, but the occupiers change. So yeah, leader of the opposition Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister Keir Starmer. It still has an element of surprise a couple of weeks in.
I thought it was interesting, Chris, you were talking earlier about how, or you were asking, Rita, whether the politics will feel different, and the Chamber certainly does already. Looking there, you could see it's absolutely rammed on our side, and there were spaces on the other side. The Chamber hasn't got enough seats for all 650 members. There are quite a few. You can actually participate from the gallery if you want to. Not just sit, but you can speak if you want to, though it hadn't been done for quite a while. But it is very striking.
Nigel Farage passing there. Richard Tice, I think I saw. Daisy, when you've done this, do you choose who you want to walk with, or is it completely random?
So clearly at the front of the queue, you can see that people are paired up, but the rest of it is sort of really, you kind of get bumped into whoever you're walking next to, and you can end up having a chat with someone who you've maybe never spoken to before. And it's really rather nice. I think for a lot of the new MPs, it's always interesting to hear what their experience of it is, because some of them take it in their stride, but for many of them, this is their first sort of ceremonial experience after swearing in. And some of them who have spent maybe months or years campaigning to get here really have to sort of pinch themselves, because it's a very real sense that this is the start of the parliamentary term. So there's the formalities of the speaker, and then of course doing you're swearing in. But this is the big thing.
Of course, a small number at the bar, but the vast majority are now back stacked up in the lobbies,
Because
trying
they
to
can't
crane
in.
to listen to the speech.
But this year with TVs, apparently.
And presumably this will be the last year with hereditaries in there.
Well, we shall see.
We shall see.
Dum, dum, dum.
The Lord Chancellor Shabana Mahmood. Now, at the heart of this ceremony, she takes the speech from her purse and presents it to the King.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government will govern in service to the country. My government's legislative programme will be mission-led and based upon the principles of security, fairness and opportunity for all. Stability will be the cornerstone of my government's economic policy, and every decision will be consistent with its fiscal rules. It will legislate to ensure that all significant tax and spending changes are subject to an independent assessment by the Office for Budget Responsibility. Bills will be brought forward to strengthen audit and corporate governance alongside pension investment. Securing economic growth will be a fundamental mission. My government will seek a new partnership with both business and working people and help the country move on from the recent cost of living challenges by prioritising wealth creation for all communities. My ministers will establish an Industrial Strategy Council. It is my government's objective to see rising living standards in all nations and regions in the United Kingdom. My ministers will get Britain building, including through planning reform, as they seek to accelerate the delivery of high-quality infrastructure and housing. They will also pursue sustainable growth by encouraging investment in industry, skills, and new technologies. My government is committed to making work pay and will legislate to introduce a new deal for working people to ban exploitative practices and enhance employment rights. It will seek to establish the appropriate legislation to place requirements on those working to develop the most powerful artificial intelligence models. My government believes that greater devolution of decision-making is at the heart of a modern dynamic economy and is a key driver of economic growth, and my ministers will introduce an English devolution bill. Legislation will be introduced to give new powers to metro mayors and combined authorities. This will support local growth plans that bring economic benefit to communities. A bill will be introduced to allow local leaders to take control of their local bus services. My ministers will bring forward legislation to improve the railways by reforming rail franchising, establishing Great British Railways, and bringing train operators into public ownership. Taken together, these policies will enhance Britain's position as a leading industrial nation and enable the country to take advantage of new opportunities that can promote growth and wealth creation. My government recognises the urgency of the global climate challenge and the new job opportunities that can come from leading the development of the technologies of the future. It is committed to a clean energy transition which will lower energy bills for consumers over time. A bill will be introduced to set up Great British Energy, a publicly owned clean power company headquartered in Scotland, which will help accelerate investment in renewable energy such as offshore wind. Legislation will be brought forward to help the country achieve energy independence and unlock investment in energy infrastructure. A bill will be introduced to support sustainable aviation fuel production. My government recognises the need to improve water quality, and a bill will be introduced to strengthen the powers of the water regulator. My government will seek to strengthen the border and make streets safer. A bill will be introduced to modernise the asylum and immigration system, establishing a new border security command and delivering enhanced counter-terror powers to tackle organised immigration crime. Legislation will be brought forward to strengthen community policing, give the police greater powers to deal with antisocial behaviour, and strengthen support for victims. Measures will be introduced to improve the safety and security of public venues and help keep the British public safe from terrorism. My government will bring forward plans to halve violence against women and girls. My ministers will seek to raise educational standards and break down barriers to opportunity. Action will be taken to get people back in employment following the impact of the pandemic. A bill will be introduced to raise standards in education and promote children's well-being. Measures will be brought forward to remove the exemption from value-added tax for private school fees, which will enable the funding of 6,500 new teachers. My government will establish Skills England, which will have a new partnership with employers at its heart, and my ministers will reform the apprenticeship levy. Legislation will be introduced to give greater rights and protections to people renting their homes, including ending no-fault evictions and reforming grounds for possession. Draft legislation will be published on leasehold and commonhold reform. A bill will be introduced to establish an independent football regulator to ensure greater sustainability in the game and strengthen protections for fans. My government will improve the National Health Service as a service for all, providing care on the basis of need, regardless of the ability to pay. It will seek to reduce the waiting times, focus on prevention, and improve mental health provision for young people. It will ensure mental health is given the same attention and focus as physical health. My ministers will legislate to modernise the Mental Health Act so it is fit for the 21st century. A bill will be introduced to progressively increase the age at which people can buy cigarettes and impose limits on the sale and marketing of vapes. My ministers will also legislate to restrict advertising of junk food to children, along with the sale of high caffeine energy drinks to children. A draft bill will be brought forward to ban conversion practices. My government will take steps to help rebuild trust and foster respect. Legislation will be brought forward to introduce a duty of candour for public servants. A bill will be introduced to establish a statutory Armed Forces Commissioner to act as a strong, independent champion for our gallant armed forces and their families. Legislation on race equality will be published in draft to enshrine the full right to equal pay in law. My government will strengthen its work with the devolved governments in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, so that the best outcomes possible are delivered for citizens across the United Kingdom. My ministers will establish a new Council of the Nations and Regions to renew opportunities for the Prime Minister, heads of devolved governments, and mayors of combined authorities to collaborate with each other. My government will continue to support the political institutions and devolved government in Northern Ireland. In consultation with all parties, measures will be brought forward to begin the process of repealing and replacing the Northern Ireland Troubles Legacy and Reconciliation Act 2023. Measures to modernise the Constitution will be introduced, including House of Lords reform, to remove the right of hereditary peers to sit and vote in the Lords. My ministers will strengthen the integrity of elections and encourage wide participation in the democratic process. The government will propose a modernisation committee of the House of Commons, which will be tasked with driving up standards, improving work practices, and reforming procedures. My government will ensure a strong defence based on the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation's common values of individual liberty, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Its commitment to NATO will remain unshakable. It will maintain a strong armed forces, including the nuclear deterrent. To ensure that the United Kingdom's defence capabilities are matched to the changing nature of global strategic threats, my government will conduct a strategic defence review. My government will continue to give its full support to Ukraine and its people, and it will endeavour to play a leading role in providing Ukraine with a clear path to NATO membership. My government will seek to reset the relationship with European partners and work to improve the United Kingdom's trade and investment relationship with the European Union. My ministers will seek a new security pact to strengthen cooperation on the mutual threats faced by the United Kingdom and the European Union. My government will play its part in trying to secure long-term peace and security in the Middle East. It is committed to a two-state solution with a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. Later this week, my government will host the European Political Community meeting at Blenheim Palace. The Queen and I look forward to our visit to Samoa alongside the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in October and our visit to Australia. Members of the House of Commons, estimates for the public services will be laid before you. My Lords and members of the House of Commons, other measures will be laid before you. I pray that the blessing of Almighty God may rest upon your councils.
Lord Chancellor Shabana Mahmood retrieving the speech, putting it back in the purse. And the pages now approach to help the monarch. And the speech now delivered, their Majesties will make their way back to the robing room. making their way back through Prince's chamber. And back through the Royal Gallery. There's a very respectful silence. It's a moment of solemnity for everyone. King and Queen now into the robing room to get ready to leave the Palace of Westminster. And MPs are beginning to return to the House of Commons chamber, where the business of politics will start up.
Can I tell my story about the first time I did this?
Yes, you can.
Sorry, in 2001, when I was an MP, I did all of that following down to the House of Lords to hear the... and it was the last year that you still had hereditary peeresses, so all the countesses and stuff, and they were all... I mean, they were dressed like in Bridgerton, only Bridgerton hadn't happened by then, and they were all wearing tiaras and diamonds and everywhere, all over the... And I turned to somebody who I thought was a new Labour MP, and I said, where do you buy a tiara like that? It turned out he was a Conservative, and he said, you do not buy a tiara, you inherit a tiara.
I've never tried to buy a tiara, Chris, so I can't tell you whether that is true or not, but yes.
I'm sure
I think
you can go and buy a tiara,
taken.
But, and just one other thing about, you know, how this is the fluidity of the British constitutional process. I know Chris is trying to listen to it.
Chris, you're trying... I'm going to stop this Chris for that Chris, actually, because you were trying to lip read, weren't you? Could you tell anything?
There was an animated conversation going on, wasn't there, between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer there, just as they were walking back into the House of Commons. And actually, it's an insight that so often, and this is a criticism I could make of myself, or more broadly parliamentary reporting, actually, is that we so often, don't we, focus on the battle of ideas and the argument. Of course we should, that's the democratic process. But so often there are perfectly human, respectful relationships that exist between people who've been in political tussles, I mean, to put an understatement, of the last couple of months. And I think, you know, when they're interacting on a personal level, there is a mutual respect between the former Prime Minister and the now Prime Minister. But to see the two of them there in conversation after everything of the last couple of months, those TV debates and all the rest of it, yeah, I'm sure there will be lip readers poring over that.
There will be lip readers.
I'd be intrigued to know what
there will
small
be
talk was exchanged.
Political battles to come as well, Chris. Just a take from you, really, on what you thought about the King's speech.
Well, there was a blizzard of new bills, wasn't there? Around about 40, if my arithmetic's anything to go by, if you include the draft bills as well. I think a mixture of the sort of big-ticket items that we heard Labour campaigning on in the general election. So to just take one example, the whole idea around rail nationalisation, that idea that rail franchises will be back in public hands as they expire, so it won't happen in the blink of an eye, but it'll happen over a period of years. Then there's a bit of cutting and pasting of ideas that there was a lot of support for across the House in the last Parliament. So things like, we were talking about it before, Martin's Law, this idea of improving the safety of public venues, and also a tobacco and vapes bill, which looks at first glance, and there's a huge pack of information I'm reading through here of the various bills that are proposed, but looks pretty similar to the idea that Rishi Sunak first suggested at the Conservative Party conference last October, this idea of a ratcheting up of the legal age at which you can buy cigarettes. So a bit of cutting and pasting from the last Parliament, if you like, tidying up where there's cross-party agreement, and then a kind of sense of the Labour manifesto in legislative form, or the beginnings of legislative form, which is going to be the nature of the debate to come in the coming hours, days, weeks and months here.
So we were wondering before the speech, Andrew Griffiths, weren't we, about whether the speech would contain those Tory bills, elements of those Tory bills that fell by the wayside when the election was called. And as Chris says, restricting cigarette sales, phasing them out over time, and improving the safety and security of public venues, Martin's Law, as you called it. They both do appear to be in there. Are the Conservatives going to support these?
Well, look, the devil will be in the detail. And what we've seen today is a whole smorgasbord of bills. I mean, you've got a lot of the socialist greatest hits, Lords reform, constitutional reform, a hell of a lot of stuff on employment rights that will add red tape for business, and some of those other bans that go much further. I mean, I think we heard about a ban on advertising of food. We're going to see the government try and attempt to regulate AI, which is a nascent technology that no one's done very successfully in the past. So, look, I don't think it's the job of the official opposition to give blank cheques, to say without seeing the detail. And there's a lot that we saw today that's internally inconsistent. You saw financial stability, yes, but you also saw big swathes of the economy being nationalised in terms of rail, local bus services coming under control, establishment of a national energy company, all of which is going to cost taxpayers a great deal amount of money.
I'll bring you in just a moment, Daisy, but I would just like you to come back on that, Chris. Socialists' greatest hits.
Some of this is just common sense, like the railways. I mean, when did you last go on a railway trip that actually functioned properly, arrived on time, or wasn't cancelled or wasn't overcrowded? I mean, we do need to do something about
There's been industrial action as well, as you're aware.
Yes, but sometimes I felt when there's industrial action, at least there's not going to be a train, whereas on other days it's endlessly cancelled. I do this all the time between here and my constituency in South Wales. It is utter misery for an awful lot of people. And you can't do Wi-Fi, you can't work on the train. There are so many things that are just common sense. I thought it was interesting, a duty of candour for public servants. I didn't know about this coming. I'm really glad about it. I think this follows on from the infected blood scandal and I would guess also from the post office scandal. Some of the things that we're doing are clearing up the messes that there have been over these last few years. Likewise, on the Office of Budget Responsibility, it's going to have an enhanced role. I think that's really important because one of the reasons that we now have mortgage rates that are £240 more a month for many, many families or even more is because of, the catastrophe of Liz Truss and refusing to take any advice from the Office of Budget Responsibility.
And they scrutinise the government's spending plans.
Exactly, and it's important that they should be able to do so properly and in a timely fashion so that you're not just plucking things out of the air because the dangers to the long-term
Does that need to be a new law, though, or is that just an opportunity to sort of jab at a previous government?
Well, it might be a bit of both. I'm happy with a bit of both, but sometimes you have to put things in statutory form to give them the bite that they need to be effective. I notice also the Modernisation Committee in the House of Commons. This is me being a bit the former chair of Committee on Standards, and all the stuff about Partygate and Owen Paterson, all that stuff in the past. I think one of the things we all saw in this general election is that we really need to burnish parliamentary reputation and the way we do politics. So the stuff that's in there, I think, is really important, but the meat and two veg is basically economic growth and planning reform, building houses, getting the NHS sorted.
Chris,
Sorry, I'll stop.
Yes.
I'm excited. I'm just very excited. We've not been able to do this for 15 years.
I have to contain you there. Daisy, what did you hear that pleased you and what was left out?
Well, I mean, I said earlier on that our priorities in the election were around the NHS, cost of living and putting an end to the sewage scandal. So, pleased to see that there are some commitments around reforming the Mental Health Act. That was something that the last government had pledged to do. I had pressed the last government to force them to say they would definitely do it. They said they would, and then they didn't in the end. Also very keen to see some of the new public health measures that have been brought forward. Certainly, we had a very strong pitch around improving public health during our general election campaign. And so there may well be lots of additional things that we want to bring to that. Obviously, very keen to see what powers will be brought forward in tackling the sewage crisis. And certainly, given how hard we have campaigned on that, if it doesn't go far enough, we'll be looking to push the government even further. But what I would say is that even though all of those bits are welcome, the fact is that, we know that day in, day out, ordinary folk just still can't see a GP and they still can't see a dentist, and the NHS has been driven into the ground and they can't see any way of fixing social care being brought forward either. We would like the government to be really, really ambitious in these areas, and I didn't see as much ambition in the King's speech on those issues as I would have liked to have seen, so I hope that there are some other announcements that follow from the King's speech that really do show that this is a really urgent issue and it's one where the public want to see real ambition.
To meet Chris Mason's point, it's absolutely right that everything isn't about legislation.
Just one other thing that I think you test this speech against, the scale of the challenges we face. Poor defence only got a review. So it didn't get any more spending, it didn't get an improved commitment, it just got a review, which is what governments do when they actually want to avoid taking a decision. So I'm disappointed there isn't more spending on defence.
That is pathetic and cheap, because it's exactly what you did in 2010. It's perfectly sensible to do a review of our armed forces and how much we should be spending.
I'm going to pause the politics again for just a moment, because the King and Queen are now leaving the Palace of Westminster, going back down the sovereign staircase with members of the Household Cavalry on either side, the Lifeguards and the Blues and Royals standing to attention there. And the Queen's outfit is very fine. It's off-white, silk crepe, and embroidered, and it's by Fiona Clare. And we can see the jewels that she's wearing. They include a diamond collet necklace, there's the King saying goodbye to Blackrod, Sarah Clark.
Can I give a shout out to the Royal School of Needlework? Because a lot of what you're seeing there has come from them. And they are, after I did this programme last time, and I mentioned them, and then they invited me, and I've been. They are absolutely amazing. It's the only university course in Europe in needlework. It's so important for the fashion industry, one of our great creative industries.
The fanfare signalling the monarch's departure. And there's the Lord Great Chamberlain, Lord Carrington, with his wand, waiting to see them off. And with the departure of the monarch, the royal insignia are leaving too. The cap of maintenance and the sword of state following on. And as we saw before, and quaint as it may seem, they have their own vehicle. And the Imperial State Crown. Carried by Lieutenant Colonel Michael Vernon, controller in the royal household. The Imperial Crown jeweller Mark Appleby is holding the crown, and he will be handing it over entrusted to an official in the carriage. And now with the departure, the imminent departure of the royal insignia, this will signal the end, really, of the pomp and pageantry and ceremony of the state opening of Parliament. with the departure of the royal insignia, let's return to the politics and to Tina Dahealy, who's in central lobby for us now.
Thank you very much, Rita. Well, I'm joined by Ellie Chowns from the Green Party and Reform's Richard Tice. Welcome. You were both watching the King's speech in the Chamber. Hope you both had a good spot.
I did actually, yes. I was surprised to be able to get in there and up some steps, and with my high heels I was able to see the King directly.
I'm lucky I'm tall, so I had a great view of the King giving the speech, and proud to represent the constituents of Boston and Skegness. Huge moment of history, pageantry, utterly remarkable just standing here.
Yeah, let's get on to the politics then and get your reaction to the content of the King's speech, Ellie.
Well, I think, we're seeing some moves in a positive direction. The King's speech is actually fairly general, isn't it? It sets out, broad sense of direction. But I think from my perspective as a Green Party MP, I would like to see much bolder action being talked about. For example, they're talking about planning reform, but then they're talking a little bit about housing. But they're not talking about nationwide home insulation. They're not talking about driving up building standards. They're not talking about rent controls. They're not talking about a lot of the things that Greens want to see. So I think there's clearly an important role for Green MPs here in Parliament to push the Labour government to be bolder and better. And in terms of climate action, they really do need to be bolder and better. Renewable energy investment is good, but they've got to be absolutely clear. No more fossil fuel extraction.
Richard.
From our perspective, Reform UK, warm words, as it always is with the King's speech. But the truth is, it's a programme. They talk about higher growth, but everything represents more taxes, more bureaucracy, more regulation. All this talk about energy, more renewable energy, will add to costs, we'll have more expensive energy. This is a programme that will lead to lower growth and people will get poorer. And that's why I think the direction of travel of this government and this programme will, over the next couple of years, be completely wrong for the British people.
They would say exactly the opposite. You're nodding your head, shaking your head rather.
I completely disagree with that. I think that investment in renewable energy, for example, and in innovation in the green industries of the future is absolutely the way that the country needs to go. We have lost so many years under the Conservatives, and we need to make that investment. From my perspective, there are some warm words here from the Labour government, but there isn't the policy detail that we need to actually follow that up yet.
Now you have both increased in your presence. Well, you've gone from Reform, have gone from no MPs to 5, Green from 1 to 4.
We had one.
How will you make your presence felt most effectively, do you think?
By being in the chamber a lot, by speaking a lot, hopefully giving the maiden speech as soon as possible, and putting forward what we think are the right policies to create growth, to essentially increase prosperity for all. Sadly, we were in the longest recession per person since records began, and I fear that this is a programme to continue that decline.
There are lots of parliamentary mechanisms that we can use to make our voices heard, but the most important thing is to use our presence here in this chamber, in this parliament, to push Labour to be bolder and braver on the issues that matter to people. That's not just tackling climate change and protecting nature, but also investing in the public services that we're also dependent upon. We had some warm words there again about the NHS, but Labour are not putting forward the investment that is needed to nurse the NHS back to health. So I'm going to be, together with my Green Party colleagues, really, really active here in the chamber, wherever we can be, to push Labour in that direction, because we've got to invest in a greener and fairer future for us all.
OK, Ellie, Richard, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Tina, thank you very much. And interesting, isn't it, Chris Mason, that we were talking about how we would hear a broader range of opinions and voices in this Parliament. They are two small parties, but they are very much in this Parliament. I wanted to talk to you, though, about one phrase that was in the King's speech, about resetting the government's relations with its European partners. I wonder how you interpret that.
Yeah, it's been fascinating how this presents itself in the coming months. We've heard it a few times now. We heard it from the Prime Minister and senior ministers at the NATO summit in Washington last week. We've heard it now there in the King's speech. The argument that the government is trying to make, and it's something of a tightrope, is that they think that the UK's relations with the European Union, as they see it, can be improved. They are saying that that does not mean going back into the big structures of the EU, the single market and the customs union, and with that freedom of movement. They talk about wanting a new veterinary agreement, for instance, trying to get the mutual recognition of qualifications. There'll be some sceptics who say, hang on a minute, remember how the country voted back in 2016? Is this, as some might see, it's a slippery slope back to a relationship that perhaps people don't want? the governments can make an argument that it's a pragmatic reassessment of our relationship with our nearest neighbours whilst respecting the fundamentals of the referendum. But it's been fascinating to see that dynamic, and we'll see it playing out again tomorrow at Buckingham Palace in Oxfordshire with the meeting of the European Political Community, which is a bigger organisation in terms of the number of countries that are members than the European Union, with the Prime Minister hosting a whole range of European leaders, some of them in the EU and some beyond.
So these words I would have thought would be music to your ears, Daisy Cooper, but Andrew Griffith, not to yours.
Well, I mean, let's see what, as Andrew said earlier, the devil's always in the detail, but fundamentally, it's very clear right across the country that the botched Brexit deal that the Conservatives negotiated has wrapped up our small businesses in red tape. It's been undermining our farmers because of who are being undermined by the sort of botched trade deals with Australia and New Zealand that's undercutting them and their produce. And so we do need to improve that trade relationship, but it's quite clear that there are other really big issues as well, whether it's a climate emergency or whether it's our defence and security. We do need to be working closer with our European allies, and with the threat from Russia and China and the possibility of a Trump presidency that may not be as committed to supporting supporting European countries in their fight to support Ukraine. We really have got to stand on our own 2 feet, and we have to rebuild the trust with our European neighbours first and foremost.
Andrew.
Well, anything that removes friction between nations, whether it's the US or the European Union, is only to the good. But it's quite naive, in my experience, to think you just rock up and say, to long-standing, experienced politicians, with democratic mandates from their own countries, that you just reset things without putting things on the table. And that's where the danger of things like reopening freedom of movement, taking a share of European immigration figures, all of those come back. Because you're dealing with hard-headed people. The previous government got the Windsor Framework done. In my area, we got a European Financial Services Memorandum of Understanding. So these conversations can happen, all to the good. No one would wish anything other than to try and remove those frictions. But it's really, really important, and I think the government should be very clear and open, what are their red lines, and is it absolutely the case that they're not going to reopen things like freedom of movement.
OK, we'll return to the discussion in just a moment. I want to go back now, though, to Tina, who's been joined by some more guests. Tina.
I have indeed. I'm with the SNP Stephen Gethins and Liz Sowell-Roberts from Plaid Cymru. 40 new bills, a big focus on growth. What was in there for Plaid?
Well, it's interesting to hear that Labour is proposing more English devolution, and we've had devolution in Wales for 25 years. The rationale for English devolution was to give greater economic levers, more to develop the economy in English areas. Why couldn't we have had further powers to actually develop the economy in Wales as well? Very specifically the Crown Estate, which would allow us to develop our own energy and keep the advantages of that. We've also looked at a situation where funding for Wales has been unfair since it was first initiated at the end of the 70s. We've been pushing for fair funding in Wales. And also, of course, the two-child limit on benefits. If that had been lifted, that would benefit 65,000 children, 11% of the children in Wales. And really, for the poverty that we're facing in many of our communities, that at a single stroke could have made such a difference. It's really disappointing to see that it's not here.
And Stephen, I know you, the SNP, were looking for the benefit cap on 2 children to be lifted as well.
That's right. I mean, obviously, an awful lot of these bills related to issues that are devolved to the Scottish Parliament. But on that 2-child cap, one of our concerns during the election was that emerging consensus between Labour and the Conservatives. I would have hoped, I'm a wee bit disappointed that they're not choosing to tackle child poverty. That has to be a priority for us all. On the point on economic growth, you're right to raise it. But the biggest thing pulling back our economic growth at the moment is Brexit. And they're continuing to pursue that hard Tory Brexit. So I'm sorry to say they've got this big majority and a wee bit of a missed opportunity this morning.
Great British Energy being headquartered in Scotland. Are you pleased about that?
Well, let's see the detail. What kind of finance is going into it? Is it investment? Does it drive our renewables? Scotland, the Scottish Government showing a huge amount of leadership on renewables, 100% of our electricity coming from renewable sources. So let's see a little bit more detail. One thing that politics in this place has taught me is have a little look at the detail first.
Liz, a huge day in Welsh politics yesterday with the First Minister resigning. Your reaction to that?
Well, of course, we can't have a situation you've got a revolving door of Welsh First Ministers coming from the Labour Party. I think the Labour Party here were very prepared to criticise the Tories doing exactly the same thing. We need an election in Wales to put the choice to the people of Wales who are calling out for change.
A diminished presence here at Westminster this time round, which must be disappointing.
Of course it's disappointing when you come back. The SNP got 30% of the vote. Labour's done very well, got its majority on 33% of the vote. But look, I've been elected and we will continue to pursue the issues we campaigned on: austerity, investing in our public services, the horrible damage that's been done on Brexit, and challenging the cost of living crisis as well. So yes, we're a diminished voice and that's disappointing, but we've still got a job to do.
All right, Stephen, Liz, thank you very much indeed.
Tina and guests, thank you very much. Chris Bryant, I wanted to ask you about Wales, because that was raised there by Liz Saville-Roberts from Plaid Cymru. You have come to Westminster with this enormous majority, but things are in turmoil in Wales, in Welsh Labour.
Yeah, and we've got to get our act together. It's as simple as that. That may take some months, but we've got to do it, because otherwise, part of our argument in the general election was we wanted a Welsh Labour government working hand in hand with a Westminster Labour government, and at the moment everything's up in the air. So we've got to get our act together. We've got to behave like a united party. We're going to have to get a new First Minister as soon as possible.
And I did say I'd let you come back quickly on the European question.
Just on Europe, look, I think this is just about, you called it pragmatic, I would call it common sense. So, for instance, Theresa May...
I said you guys would describe it as pragmatic.
Oh, right, yes, fair. I'm not attributing Labour...
He has no opinion.
...to a BBC... No, indeed. But my point was that Theresa May, when she started the process of Brexit, she said she wanted a security treaty with Europe. I think that is an absolutely sensible, perfectly wise thing for us to be seeking to achieve. I have responsibility for the creative industries in DCMS. I'd love British artists to be able to tour across the whole of Europe. I mean, it seems... I went to see Depeche Mode in Cologne earlier this year. The Germans just can't get enough of Depeche Mode, and I'm sure there are lots of young artists who would like to be able to tour. There are similar issues for lots of other industries where we just need to unpick the daft things that we've got at the moment and put some common sense. As it happens, floristry is one of the things that I care about as well. You're not able to bring in solidago, dianthus and orchids into this country without additional fees. Why on earth? There haven't been any instances of problems over these years. So there's just so many, and you could repeat this in many, many industries. We just need to get that right.
I think as well, I think people have forgotten the damage that was done from the sort of tweeting diplomacy of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. And, Andrew said, of course they'll want something back. Well, actually, I think just re-establishing trust and good relations with, fellow European countries is the first step, and that can't be underrated.
Sharing criminal data across Europe. There are just so many things where you think, if you spoke to an ordinary member of the public, they go, why on earth aren't we doing this now?
Collaboration on health and science as well.
Chris Mason, a quick word. Is this going to ruffle feathers in some quarters, the idea of closer cooperation?
I think it will do for some. It's interesting, isn't it? Because listening to the conversation just now, there's an element of a flashback to the sort of Brexit years, but the conversation now is sort of, I think, to a degree recalibrated around tweaking, rather than, of course, there are some who will make the bigger picture arguments about the UK's long-term future. But it's certainly from the government's perspective, they seem to be making an argument about tweaking, and then it's an extent to which what can they get in a process of negotiation. The Conservatives would make an argument that they had recalibrated the UK's relationship with the EU post-Brexit with the Windsor Framework negotiations, and there was a different tenor to that conversation than there had been to the sort of noisy, quite angry conversations of the years before, and it'll be the challenge for the new government as to the extent to which they can take that forward.
But I think Putin has changed this yet again. In relation to the security issues.
We need to hear some more voices. Chris, I'm going to just pause you there for a moment and return to Tina in Central Lobby.
Thanks, Rita. I'm with Carla Lockhart from the Democratic Unionist Party and Colin Eastwood from the SDLP. Let's get your reaction then to the government's agenda for the next year. Carla.
Well, look, there's lots in the speech that we would welcome. We look at the Council of Regions and Nations. That's something to be welcomed, something that will strengthen our regions, and the nation as a whole is always something to be welcomed. I look at the apprenticeship levy. I have a large manufacturing base in Northern Ireland. That is something we will be working with the government on. The legacy issue, the repeal of the legislation is welcome. However, the devil's in the detail, and we need to see more around that. It's important.
That's what we keep hearing.
Yeah.
Colin? What were you looking for?
Well, I'm delighted to see the Legacy Act is going to be binned. That's a big victory for victims. Of course, that act was an odious kind of anti-democratic piece of legislation, which gave impunity to murderers and did nothing to bring about the reconciliation of our people. So I think that's a very, very positive move.
And Sinn Féin now the largest Northern Ireland party at Westminster. A big blow for the DUP.
Well, Sinn Féin don't take their seats. They have no voice in this chamber. We will be a large voice for unionism and for the issues like the legacy. We will be speaking out on behalf of victims. We will be pushing the UK government to push the Irish government to do more on legacy. We only had to look, and we're disappointed that there wasn't more spoken about on Northern Ireland's restoration of Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom because of the overreach of the protocol and the Windsor Framework. So we will be working with our colleagues along the unionist benches to ensure that our rightful place is restored.
And Colin, what are you looking for from a working relationship with Labour?
Well, I think we've got a very good relationship with the Labour Party, and we're seeing that with the Legacy Act being scrapped. But there's lots of other things we want to see this government do. We want to see them recognise the state of Palestine. It's gone some way in the King's speech.
They did mention a two-state solution.
Yeah. And I think it's very positive, but I think the government should now, and Parliament should now recognise the state of Palestine as a clear signal that this can't go on in Gaza any longer, and we should stop the sale of weapons to Israel, who are using them as part of a genocide in the people of Palestine.
Thank you both very much. Carla, Colin, thank you.
And thank you to Tina as well. Well, it's been a fascinating morning, but it is time to draw an end to our coverage and get some final thoughts from my guests. I'll start with my colleague Chris Mason first. What has struck you most, maybe about what wasn't in the speech?
Yeah, there is kind of the reflection on. I mean, I'm most struck by just the sheer quantity of what the government is attempting, and then I guess what comes next is the order in which they are pursued, because that'll give us a further indication of the kind of prioritisation in terms of the new government's sort of legislative programme. And then now we stand on the brink of the roaring return of politics. You know, we've had the ceremony of this morning. Obviously, there was the election campaign before that, but then the Commons coming together this afternoon for the debate, and we'll hear from the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition and get a proper, real sense for the, not quite the first time, but almost, of how that new House of Commons feels and looks.
And Chris Bryant, can you give us a sense of the priorities that Chris Mason is talking about?
Economic growth, because if we don't get more... if the people of Britain are poorer at the end of this Parliament, as they were at the end of last Parliament, for the first time in our history, then people aren't going to want another term of Labour government. But more importantly, we need to be able to fund... Of course, we want to get the NHS back on track. How are we going to do that unless we're going to be able to... We have economic growth in the country. We use the tools of AI to be able to deliver our services more effectively. But I just... If I'm honest... I've got two thoughts in my head. One is I'm completely overexcited. You might have caught that impression already about all the things we've got to do, and some of these bills will be coming into my on my desk. But also the sense of the weight of work that there is to do.
I'm going to stop you there, Chris, because the excitement otherwise will get carried away with itself.
I know, sorry.
Andrew Griffiths.
Well, unlike Chris, I'm not overexcited. This is the moment of maximum danger, actually. You've got a government that has not got a mass popular mandate. A win's a win, but they've come on in. We've seen a smorgasbord, actually, today. A lot of these bills, I agree with Chris about the ends, which is economic growth, prosperity of our nation. I fundamentally disagree with the means. You've got more regulation, more red tape, more employment practices, and things like vindictive attacks on private schools that are driving millionaires out of this country just at the moment when we need that investment.
I'd like a last word from Daisy.
I'm going to sound like a stuck record. NHS and social care, NHS and social care, cost of living and sewage crisis. Those are our priorities. And with 72 MPs now, the best result ever for the Liberal Democrats, we are a force, a really strong force now in Parliament. And you'll be hearing from us day in, day out on how we can fix social care and the NHS. And Ed Davey will, of course, be leading a party, and we will collectively be a voice for care.
Where we can do that cross-party, even better.
There we go. Amen to that.
Very pithily put. Thank you very much to all of you. This year's State Opening of Parliament has been a feast for the eyes, as it always is. But with the tradition comes the laying out of our politics for the next year ahead, as you've just heard, very heatedly put, with the new government's stated ambitions and priorities. So that is an end to our programme for today. Coverage of the debate on the King's speech continues on BBC Two and iPlayer with Politics Live. But from all the BBC team at Westminster, thank you for watching and goodbye.
it's quite